Stone, your response to what Peter King is saying.
He's just wrong. The Supreme Court in the Pentagon Papers case, for example, made very clear that Daniel Ellsberg could be prosecuted as a public official stealing information, that the New York Times and the Washington Post could not be restrained from publishing that information. The court has essentially held that although the government can control classified information at its source by prohibiting employees from revealing it, once the information goes out, it cannot then punish the press for publishing it. It's a little bit odd as a system, but the idea is that on the one hand we have freedom of the press, which has to be preserved. On the other hand, the government has a legitimate interest in maintaining confidentiality at the source within the government itself. So no, clearly Grunwald and Reuters and so on, none of those can be, the Guardian, none of those can be punished consistent with the First Amendment. That's clear.
Professor Stone, so do you believe that Edward Snowden's position is comparable to Daniel Ellsberg's position with the Pentagon Papers, and that the Guardian played a comparable role to the New York Times?
So I think Snowden's position, based upon what I know now, is much worse. Ellsberg revealed historical information that had really no appreciable threat to the national security. It was all old information about what the government had done in the past. What Snowden has revealed is information about ongoing programs which we're told are extremely important to the national security, and we're told that the revelation of those programs makes them far less efficient. That's a very serious, potentially very serious harm to the nation. That was not the case in Ellsberg's situation.
But Professor Stone,
so I think from that standpoint,
Henry Kissinger said Dan Ellsberg was the most dangerous man in America. So they certainly at that time, they were telling us that what he was doing was threatening national security.
He said that at the time, before they had an opportunity to really reflect on what was released. Years later, or even weeks later, that was no longer the case. So I think that those two situations are not remotely comparable in terms of the harm that Ellsberg did to the country, which I think was trivial relative to what Snowden has done, which arguably is far more serious. Let me make another point about civil liberties here, by the way. It's extremely important to understand that if you want to protect civil liberties in this country, you not only have to protect civil liberties, you also have to protect against terrorism. Because what will destroy civil liberties in this country more effectively than anything else is another 9/11 attack. And if the government is not careful about that, and if we have more attacks like that, you can be sure that the kind of things the government's doing now are going to be regarded as small potatoes compared to what would happen in the future. So it's very complicated asking what's the best way to protect civil liberties in the United States.
I just don't buy this argument that, you know, this hurts national security. I covered al-Qaeda for the New York Times, and believe me, they know they're being monitored. The whole idea that somehow it comes as a great surprise to jihadist groups that their emails, websites, and phone calls are being tracked is absurd. We're talking about the wholesale collection of information on virtually most of the American public, and the consequences of that are truly terrifying. At that point, we are in essence snuffing out the capacity of any kind of investigation into the inner workings of power. And to throw out this notion that this harmed national security, there's no evidence for that, in the same way that there is no evidence that the information that Bradley Manning leaked in any way harmed national security. It didn't. What the security and surveillance state is doing is playing on fear and using that fear to accrue to themselves tremendous forms of power that in a civil society, in a democracy, they should never have. And that's the battle that's underway right now, and frankly, we're losing.
I wanted to ask you, Professor Stone, to reflect on Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, written April 16, 1963, when he said, "One who breaks an unjust law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for law." Could you respond to that?
Obviously, King is right. The question is whether it's an unjust law. So people who violate a law because they think it is unjust don't necessarily fit within the letter from the Birmingham jail. King was talking about protesting racial segregation, and that's a little bit different in terms of the moral status of it. Now, maybe it's true. I mean, maybe Chris Hedges is right, and maybe that that Snowden is a hero, and maybe this is all a fraud on the part of the government. This information serves no useful purpose, and it's fundamentally important to the United States that it's been revealed. Maybe that's true, and if it turns out to be true, then I'll be the first to say Snowden was a hero. But at the moment, I have absolutely no reason to believe that. And to say that some people act on legitimate conscience and therefore violate unjust laws is not to say that everyone who violates a law is Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail.
I want to put that question to Chris, but I wanted to ask you, Geoffrey Stone, if you were Edward Snowden's attorney, what arguments would you put forward for him right now?
Legally, I don't think he has, honestly, I don't think he has any legal arguments that would be a defense to the charge that he violated the law about government contractors not disclosing classified information to persons who are not authorized to receive it. I don't think he has a defense. Some people commit a crime, and they committed the crime. And I don't know that there's any defense sometimes.
Interestingly, Dan Ellsberg faced treason trial, but ultimately he ended up being exonerated because of the illegal wiretapping that was done of him.
Well, he wasn't exonerated. In his case, the judge dropped the charges against him because the Nixon administration searched his psychiatrist's office in violation of the Constitution, and the judge concluded that that was prosecutorial misconduct and therefore dismissed the prosecution. If the government does something similar in Snowden's case and the court finds that it's a violation of his constitutional rights in the course of the investigation and dismisses the charges, that would be something, as his lawyer, I'd certainly want to know. But on the merits of the charge as it presently stands, I think it's a sentencing question, not a criminality question.
Chris Hedges, if you could respond to the King quote and the significance of what Snowden did.
Well, without figures like Snowden, without figures like Manning, without figures like Julian Assange, essentially the blinds are drawn. We have no window into what's being done in our name, including the crimes that are being done in our name. Again, having worked as an investigative reporter, the lifeblood of my work were figures like these who had the moral courage to stand up and name the crimes that they witnessed. And these people are always at the moment that they stand up. And even King, of course, was persecuted and reviled and denounced, hounded by J. Edgar Hoover, who attempted through blackmail to get him to commit suicide before accepting the Nobel Prize. Let's not forget that all of these figures, like Snowden, come under this character assassination, which, frankly, I think Professor Stone is engaging in. And that's not uncommon. That's what comes with the territory when you carry out an act of conscience. It's a very lonely and frightening, and it makes these figures, like Snowden, deeply courageous. Because the whole debate, traitor or whistleblower, for me, hearing this on the press is watching the press commit collective suicide. Because without those figures, there is no press.
I wanted to end with Professor Stone. You were an early advisor to President Obama. You gave him his first job at University of Chicago Law School. You were the dean of the University of Chicago Law School. What would you advise him today?
I think there needs to be a really careful reevaluation of the classification system. There's no question that we wildly overclassify, and that creates all sorts of problems, both for the press and for the ability of the government to keep secrets, because if you try to keep everything secret, you don't effectively keep very much secret. So I think that's critical. I think there is a serious question about how we make the trade-off between security and privacy, and I think that that's an issue that needs to be addressed carefully, certainly within the administration, within the government, to the extent there are genuinely secret policies that need to be kept secret, and I believe that's perfectly possible, then I think that does not immunize them from serious debate by responsible people within the four corners of the administration, bringing in people who can have national security clearances to take the devil's advocate position and challenge these issues. So I think there's a lot that can and should be done, and I think that it's easy to get swept up in the notion of security being the be-all and end-all. This is a nation that's committed to individual privacy, to freedom of the press, to freedom of speech, and those values need to be respected. And I think government constantly has to be re-examining itself because all the temptations are in the wrong direction.
Professor Geoffrey Stone, before we conclude, I'd like to ask you about an article you wrote in 2011 for the New York Times called Our Untransparent President. You wrote, quote, "The record of the Obama administration on this fundamental issue of American democracy has surely fallen short of expectations. This is a lesson in trust us. Those in power are always certain that they themselves will act reasonably, and they resist limits on their own discretion. The problem is, trust us is no way to run a self-governing society." End quote. What's your assessment of the comments that you made then relative to now and Obama's record on transparency and civil liberties?
I think the comment was correct then, and I think it's correct today. I think that there's a temptation on the part of public officials to basically say, we don't want to be hassled, we don't want to be bothered, we don't want to be criticized, so we'll just do what's in the best interest of the country, and we don't have to tell anybody about it. And that's a huge danger in a democracy. But the fact that I accept that and passionately believe it does not mean that everything the government does in confidence and in secret should not be in confidence or in secret. The problem is where they draw the line. So yes, I would criticize the Obama administration in general for being overly concerned with secrecy and not being sufficiently transparent. The point I made earlier about overclassification is a good example. But at the same time, I do recognize that there are situations in which secrecy is critical, and the problem is being able to discern when that's necessary and when it's not. And to do that, you need to have people within the debate who are internally challenging the necessity for secrecy and confidentiality. I don't think the Obama administration has done a very good job of that.
Chris Hedges, just 30 seconds, and I know that you were attending the Bradley Manning trial, but linking the two.
Well, we're talking about the death of a free press, the death of a civil society. This is far beyond a reasonable debate. We make this East German Stasi state look like the Boy Scouts. And if we don't wrest back this power for privacy, for the capacity to investigate what our power elite is doing, I think we can essentially say our democracy has been snuffed out.
Chris Hedges and Geoffrey Stone, I want to thank you for being with us. Geoffrey Stone, former dean at the University of Chicago Law School, now professor there. His recent piece for the Huffington Post is called Edward Snowden, Hero or Traitor. Chris Hedges, longtime journalist, now senior fellow at the Nation Institute, foreign correspondent for the New York Times, before that for 15 years, part of the team that won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of global terrorism. This is Democracy Now! When we come back...